Good morning and welcome to Let's Coach 2023. I'm Lani Kim and I'm one of the coaches here on campus. So, welcome, whether you're new to campus or whether you're returning to campus. Thank you for being here with me. And today, what we're going to talk about is relationships, the relationships in your life. Because really, this is all what life is about, right? Without relationships, we feel lonely and isolated, and we really don't have any partners in life. Right now, when I say partner, that's not necessarily a romantic relationship, but just a partner in general, friendship, whether it's work or business. So I wanted to talk about relationships and not only what type of relationships we have, but the purpose of each relationship and how we value our relationships, how and the input into these relationships. And there is a certain aspect of what are we putting into relationships and what are we getting out of relationships, but not a quid quo pro expectation, but just really how is that relationship working out in the end? Is it working for both parties, or is it a relationship that consumes energy but may not produce a healthy or productive result? So, this is a time to, first of all, decide what are you looking for in relationships and to take stock of the different types of relationships that you have and maybe even where you're looking for relationships. So, if you have, do you have friendships? Do you have um, relationships with family? Do you have a romantic relationship? Relationship as maybe a parent, relationship at work. Do you have relationships with your community? Right now, community is a general term, but where you live, do you have relationships within your living community, right? And then it may be, do you have relationships within a different type of community that you may be involved in? So, a professional organization or an interest group, a hobby group, an extracurricular group. So, it's looking at the different relationships that are available to us, the relationships that we currently do have, and also looking at where do we maybe have a gap that we are looking to fill in terms of a relationship. And this is kind of like the, you know, 5,000 feet in the air look. It's just a general check in on all of these different aspects to relationships and really to get your brain thinking about relationships and being conscious of relationships, right? Now, there's definitely relationships that we are more conscious of. There are titles that we have, maybe so parent, right? Um, or spouse. Those are more obvious types of relationships. But what about all the other types of relationships, right? So spouse would usually include one person, right? So that's a fairly limited category of people. And then children, and even if you have a bigger family, right? There's just a limit to those relationships too, right? So we have the potential to have all these other types of relationships, and maybe you do have a lot of other types of relationships. So let's take stock of those, because that often consumes so much of our energy, right? The way you interact with people, the expectations they have from you, the expectations you have from them, the actual interaction between the two parties, right? And this affects our emotional well being. And it could be for the better, or it could take a toll on our mental well being. So, taking stock of the relationships that you have in life, it may seem um, very, um, what was I going to say? Not sterile, but prudent and practical, right? But this is life. Life is all about relationships, and we want to see where our energies are going. And is it going towards not so much just productivity, but relationships that are healthy, right? Or are we spending so much time in relationships that are not healthy, right? So it's to take stock of all of that. And also, where are we with those relationships? And just because a relationship may not be working out presently doesn't mean that it cannot work out and be a healthy relationship in the future, right? But that does require us being intentional about examining that relationship and then deciding what are our boundaries around that relationship. What are some things in that relationship that may be heading or have headed in a direction that is not healthy? Where do we need to set that boundary of, okay, maybe pulling back a little bit, and really deciding what those boundaries are, right? Now, remember that the boundaries are going to be controlled by you, not the other person, right? So it's not like in a relationship, we go to someone and say, hey, here's my boundaries. Please don't cross them, right? A boundary really is something that we control. It is not someone else's responsibility, but it is our responsibility to follow through with those boundaries. So what I mean by this is if you have, for instance, a friend who is consistently late, right? And you obviously, for obvious reasons, they're late, number one. But number two, maybe this is starting to become a pattern and affect the way that you experience life, right? So I definitely had a friend who's still a friend. So again, the relationship can work out, but setting those boundaries, right? Being responsible for those boundaries, you are responsible for those boundaries, not the other person, does take work, and it can feel a little uncomfortable. So I had a friend who was consistently late. And here's the thing, she's still late. But the way I responded to her changed. So it used to be I would go to pick her up because I was always the one to drive. And then I would wait around until she was ready. get really frustrated, which is not great for our relationship. And then we would leave, and then I would just be really frustrated and irritated, right? And to her, it wasn't a big deal. To her personally, it wasn't a value that she had. Being on time wasn't a value to her. um, and so I had to realize that. And, definitely looking back, because we've been friends for years, we've known each other since middle school. I realized that just being on time wasn't a value to her. I thought, of course, it's a value to her. Who doesn't want to be on time, right? But it really honestly wasn't a value to her. So I didn't have it as articulate now in my head as back then, but I had to start to make boundaries in my own head and obviously express them to her in the sense of um, just letting her know the consequence, not so much saying and not explaining it as a punishment, right? So I think too often we think a consequence means it's a punishment and it's very negative, a negative experience. This was just saying, okay, what am I willing to do and what am I not willing to do, right? What is that boundary? And to me, certain events I wanted to be on time for. And I had to let her know this is when I'm picking you up. And if you are not ready, this was pre, not pre cell phone, but before everyone had a cell phone. Let's put it that way. So I did have to go to her house most of the time and just let her know, hey, this is my obligation that I committed to. If you're not ready, then you can find another way to get there. And that was it. It had nothing to do with her. I controlled the consequence and I had my reasons for that. And it wasn't a pointing finger at like, well, you're always late. You always do this. It just was like, hey, this is my obligation to be here at 7 o'clock. This is when I'm going to come by. And if you are not ready by whatever time, that means that I have to get going so I can fulfill my obligation to be there at a certain time, right? And finding even techniques that were helpful. So I found if I picked up multiple people, that was helpful. And I would pick her up first because she lived on the farthest. So I would tell her, okay, I'm going to pick you up first, but then I have to go pick up this person at this time. So this is when we're leaving, which made it really not personal, right? It was about being courteous of the other people I'm picking up. So of course we need to leave on time, right? And so explaining that to her, just it wasn't personal. It's just commitments I made and she could either hop on board or not. So, and again, we're still friends to this day. So clearly there is a way to work through these boundaries and create a better relationship, right? A relationship that's not maybe not constantly, but you know, that is affected by the lack of boundaries in a way that you start to develop negative feelings towards that relationship, right? You want to take that time to invest and decide what those boundaries are and how to work them out, right? So, like I said, for me, it was picking up multiple people and that making it non personal as to why I have to leave at a certain time, right? Um, so looking at relationships, um, and you probably have more. not probably, but you may have more non-family relationships than family relationships. So examining those relationships. How much time are you investing? What expectations do you have out of these relationships? And at the end of the day, are they healthy relationships? Right? Because if it is not healthy for you on your side, I guarantee, regardless of how you've tried to work around the other person, it's not a healthy relationship for them. Because if they are overstepping boundaries that are reasonable, then that's probably an area of their life that they may need to work on. And if you allow them to continue um, poor habits, you're just encouraging, enabling them, right? And they're probably doing this in other relationships. So, you know, setting those boundaries is not just for you, it's also for them, right? Now, the boundary being for them is more of a um, secondary um, result, right? That's not the direct result. We're not trying to change them personally, permanently. It's just we're changing us and how we deal with the situation, which will, in effect, change how they conduct themselves, right? Or they can choose not to. And it may come to a point where that's just not a relationship that's active that you have anymore. Or it may be that you step back from that relationship and you don't pour as much time and energy into it. And that's okay, right? So, taking stock of your relationships, and I think of it like an audit. You know how we have taxes at the end of the year? Well, actually, more like, at least here in the States, the beginning of the next year. The new year comes upon us, and now it's not only about it's a new year, I have some goals for this year, but it's also a audit of how we've spent our money, how we've managed our money or not managed our money. And so it's this process, right? Which sometimes tells us a lot about ourselves, how we manage our money. But I want to encourage you to do an audit of your relationships too, and to make sure that you are protecting your time and your energy, right? And again, the result of the relationship doesn't need to be quid pro pro. It's not a I put this in, you put this in, we're 50-50. I'm not saying that at all, but know what your boundaries are in each of those relationships. And yes, a lot of times we may have relationships that we enter into that we know we are giving more than 50-50, right? And it's hard to quantify a relationship like that, but we may quantify it as knowing we're going to be putting more into that relationship. However, understanding that what is the time and energy that you have for that relationship, and what is the time and energy you want to put into that relationship, right? And then at the end of the day, is that the way it's working out? Or is it drawing additional energy and time out of you that you are not, I wouldn't say not willing to put into it, but that just isn't part of your greater plan for yourself, right? So, relationships like with your children, right? Especially if they're younger, and even if they're not, um, you have that expectation that you have more than 50% of the responsibility of that relationship. But how that plays out can look very, very different, right? It can be energy sucking and exhausting, or it can be very fulfilling. But the responsibility is primarily on you, right? But the energy to maintain the responsibility can look very different, right? With significant others, right? And there's seasons of life, right? You will go through with your partner that maybe 50% of the energies may be coming out of over 50% of the energies may be coming out of you because their circumstances require that, right? And then it may be flipped, right? But in terms of responsibility, that responsibility should be 50-50, right? And it doesn't have to be 50-50 in everything, is not what I'm saying, right? Like I cook 3.5 days and you cook 3.5 days. But in terms of responsibility of how the relationship is run, that should be 50-50, right? Um, and so taking stock of these, an audit of these relationships, right? Friendships that you have, or do you have friendships, right, that you've nurtured out of habit, but maybe they, like my friend, need to have boundaries put into it, or maybe you need to rethink that relationship and how you are going to either let go of it or maintain it in a different way. So I really want you to think about this because so much of our time and energy is put into relationships, right? Even if they're not deeply personal, even in a um, work atmosphere where you may not be particularly close with these people, there may not be a personal relationship outside of work with these people, but how many hours do you spend at work, right? And what dynamic do you have with these people? So to audit those relationships too, right? Um, so I just want to encourage you to take stock of those relationships and to be intentional with how you think about those relationships and how you respond to those relationships. Because if you notice that you are reacting and not responding, right? Reacting is a primitive brain, quick at the moment reaction, right? Not looking at the longevity of the relationship. And that's become your mode, then that relationship definitely needs an audit, right? Um, and right, going back to making sure you're responding to these relationships, right? Or in these relationships, not reacting, right? So the where you are finding yourself reacting is really where you want to do some purposeful audits. All right. So I hope this was super helpful to you. I know that it is something that I have to be reminded of to do from time to time. And really, it usually comes down to us and the amount of responsibility we are willing to take or we don't want to take in that relationship. So we have to not examine so much the other person, but really ourselves. And um, why are we avoiding those boundaries? Usually because we're avoiding the responsibility of those boundaries. And that's really about us. But we also control that responsibility. So it may seem like a lot of work, but it's also empowering to know that we have these choices on what that relationship looks like. right? We're not a victim to that relationship. And we can be empowered to be responsible for that relationship, which means that when we are looking at a relationship that may not be the healthiest, when we can set those healthy boundaries, that means we're going to conserve time and energy either to reinvesting back into this relationship because it's in a place that's healthier, or we have just more time and energy for ourselves, or maybe we want to invest it into a different relationship, but we have that time and energy and we get to decide what we want to do with it, right? Instead of feeling like, well, I have to because this person's a coworker. You may have to interact with them, but you really get to set those boundaries and how you spend your time and energy, right? Or a spouse or a child, right? These relationships that feel obligatory, we get to choose how we how responsible we are for them and what they look like in our own lives, right? How much time and energy they take from us. Um, so that's really my encouragement to you, is to examine these relationships that you have in life. And I'd love to hear any questions that you have about relationships. And if you are struggling with the idea of boundaries, definitely that's questions that you can ask about. And who knows, maybe there's another coach doing a session on boundaries. There's definitely our YouTube channel with lots of resources for you. If you are feeling like, I want to go check this out now, I guarantee you there are going to be videos on boundaries. And I'm pretty sure I've done one myself. So there is help and assistance and support for you if you're feeling like, what does that look like to create these boundaries? Or even, I need help with auditing these relationships. We want to be a resource to you. So if you have specific questions, you can go on our website, or you can simply email us at hello@lifecoachuniversity.com. And we are so happy to point you in the direction of resources or to respond to your requests. We love to hear from you. All right, have a good weekend, and I will see you next week. Take care.